Hey everybody, CyberTile back with you. We're continuing our review of hanging pawns. Specifically, this section we're looking at how to fight with them. We're looking at a couple of examples of the key d-pawn break. Really, when you're fighting with hanging pawns, the d-pawn break is the very first thing you need to be looking at virtually every move once you have this structure. So we're going to look at a few examples of this just because this d-pawn break is so key. It's more or less what everything in the hanging pawns revolve around. There are, of course, other factors that we'll look at, but this is really the key. That pawn break of pushing the d pawn forward is often what unleashes the potential of the hanging pawn's position. We're looking at a nice little miniature today. This is between Vitaly Chekhover and Chekhover-Levenfish, 1934. Chekhover was white, e6. d5, so black just transposes to a queen's gambit declined. A lot of times, black will happily play this if white plays knight f3 to avoid the nimzo. Then he plays d5, and he gets to say that he got white to commit to knight f3 before they entered a queen's gambit structure. Here, all of white's options are open to him. He hasn't committed to knight f3 yet. Of course, it's perfectly fine to play knight f3. But right now, all of white's options are open to him. And white plays knight f3 immediately. This is perfectly fine. It's just a matter of taste. The two other main moves, bishop g5, this is... I haven't looked at the numbers, but I would say it's probably the main modern move. This is the main line. Once Harry Nelson at Pillsbury got his hands on this in the early aughts of the 1900s, he really forged this into a very feared attacking weapon, and this has been the main line more or less ever since. Other moves, cx d5, this is the exchange queen's gambits. Whenever I played queen's gambit as white, this is my choice. These sort of positions appeal to a wide variety of players. This appealed to Samuel Reshevsky, who was a very concrete positional player, but it also appealed to Garry Kasparov, who is, in my opinion, the greatest attacking player of all time. So these sorts of positions have appealed to a wide variety of players. Taken on d5, this is leads to the mainline Carlsbad structure. And this is more or less like the Roy Lopez of d-pawn openings. This is a position where white has a stable, comfortable advantage, and he can milk this basically all day if he likes to. It's become a little bit fashionable for white to avoid the Carlsbad structure, and we get into this position in the game itself. This is the semi-Tarrasch, and this avoids the mainline Carlsbad slog. But knight f3 was played. c5, so this is the Tarrasch. If you're looking for a queen's pawn opening as black and you don't mind playing with an isolated pawn, in my opinion, the Tarrasch is perfectly fine. Black gets his fair share of play. There's really only some very specific main lines where black has a lot of theoretical preparation, where he has to suffer quite a bit. If you're playing at a more casual level, in my opinion, the Tarrasch is perfectly fine. You're just going to get your share of the play. And if you enjoy playing with an isolated pawn, it's a very enjoyable opening. cx d5, knight x d5. So this stays in the semi-Tarrasch. This avoids the isolated pawn for black. Of course, taken in d5, this would be the mainline Tarrasch. And this leads to an isolated pawn for black, more or less consistently. The specific main line here. And white has three mainline options here. You can play bishop g5, which is the most popular move. You can take on c5, often followed by knight a4. Or you can play b3 here. All three have been in vogue lately. I would say white always has a little bit of an edge in all of these. But black always has his share of the play. If you take the time to master the Tarrasch and understand the tactics, and you enjoy playing with an isolated pawn, these positions are quite enjoyable. In my opinion, the Tarrasch is a perfectly fine opening. But knight x d5, this avoids the isolated pawn. This is a semi-Tarrasch. The price, theoretically, is that white gets to set up this broad center, this d4-e4 pawn center. If there's been one thing that's been evaluated in modern play, it's been showing how little this pawn center can matter sometimes if the side facing them still has comfortable slots for pieces. A lot of the venom has been taken out of the semi-Tarrasch, specifically this position here. This is the main line even today. In my opinion, black is perfectly fine. This is a perfect example of how this pawn couplet, this d4-e4 broad pawn center, a lot of times doesn't really matter. It's sort of an extension of hypermodern theory. The hypermodern said that you had to attack a center like this, or else you would be worse. Modern theory almost says it doesn't matter if you have a center like this if it doesn't accomplish anything. And that's sort of the final culmination of concrete modern chess. It doesn't matter how your position looks, it matters what it accomplishes. Here, black isn't inconvenienced in the slightest by this pawn center here. So it looks nice, but all of the venom has been taken out of white's position here. This is sort of an established drawing weapon for black at the top level. Of course, casual play, you can play anything. But white chooses not to play e4. This would be my choice too. White plays e3. In my opinion, this keeps a lot of the tension of the position. And it leads to can lead to an isolated queen pawn position, which just tends to have a lot more dynamic play for white left in it. Knight c6, bishop d3, castle. Knight x3. This sort of proactively reinforces white's center, in my opinion, for no real gain. Plus, it's black spending the tempo to do this, so it is a loss of time on black's hand. Of course, black could choose to take on d4. And this would be a mainline isolated queen pawn position. Here, if I remember my theory right, bishop f6 is the most useful move. But white has a little bit of a something here. This is sort of a modern mainline for this position. In my opinion, strongest would just be castles. And a lot of positions like these, you'll often find that maintaining the tension and not being the one to break the tension is the best choice. In black breaking the tension with knight x c3, he's the one spending the time to do that, so it's a loss of time on his part. Black should just continue with his development and try to force white to be the one to spend the time to break the tension, to make that time investment. One potential line, rook e1, and just b6. Just keep the tension in place. In my opinion, black is perfectly fine. Both sides have chances. But yeah, taking on c3, it's a loss of time. Black is the one spending the time to break the tension, and it reinforces white's center needlessly. Castle. Queen c2, not mandatory, but it's a good thematic move. White's investing some time to weaken black's kingside to provoke that either g6 or h6, and then hopefully gain something from those pawn weaknesses later on. Another way of playing this would be bishop b2. This is sort of more of the classical, centrally oriented way. In my opinion, it's not as good as queen c2, because, again, this pawn center looks nice, and you still have the d5 break to potentially bust open these bishops' potential, but look at how that e4 pawn blocks out both the d3 bishop and the rook in e1. In some ways, white's attacking potential has been reduced by moving this pawn to e4. Queen c2, just leaving that pawn in e3 in some ways retains white's full attacking potential by leaving that important b1 to h7 diagonal open. So queen c2, in my opinion, it's the more dynamic choice. To queen e2. So now that white has provoked this weakness of h6, white moves his queen back to its more optimal square. Queen c2 wasn't a great square for it. He just wanted to provoke either h6 or g6. And now the queen goes back to its more natural square. Queen c7, probably this would be better first. Black really needs to finish mobilization. Again, if you're confused in a position of what to do, generally finishing your development, it's hard to go wrong doing that. And here, the bishop just belongs in b7. It's his only good diagonal. Queen c7, b6. Notice the queen goes to c7, so white immediately moves rook to c1. That's pretty thematic. c4. So this is not necessarily the best move, but in my opinion, it's the most dynamic and most interesting move. So white advances the pawn, but he doesn't advance the e-pawn, so he leaves this b1 to h7 diagonal still open. So that avenue of attacking the king side is still completely open, and he's also still planning the d4-d5 break. In my opinion, practically, this c4 advance is more desirable. The more quote-unquote correct move would be e4. But this is just going to be a much more closed-up game. Notice that the bishop on b2 is fairly unhappy still. We haven't moved that pawn to c4 to help unmask that bishop. Plus, this bishop on b1 isn't happy either. This pawn on a4, again, it closes off that key b1 to h7 attacking diagonal. Now, theoretically, white has a stronger center to help compensate for that. But again, if your center isn't accomplishing anything concrete, it just looks nice. And it's hard to pinpoint something that this pawn duo is doing that compensates for these bishops being a bit more locked out of the attacking game than otherwise. So c4, in my opinion, practically is a better choice because it's more aggressive. You're still planning that d4-d5 break. In some ways, it's stronger because you're including that idle pawn in c3 in that break, and you're retaining e4 as a push after d5. Plus, these bishops on b2 and d3 are much happier. They have more open lines of attack against the black king side. So, cx-d4. This is nearly a decisive mistake all by itself. Just like the Kasparov-Portish game that preceded this video. Give that one a look as well. Look at all my videos. The goal of the defending side is to keep things closed up. If you're opening things up, with like taking a d4, you're doing the attacking side's job. You want to keep the position as closed up as possible. You don't want to be opening the position up with a move like cx-d4. This is nearly decisive all by itself. The correct move for black, just finish mobilization and keep things clogged up. And then knight a5. In these structures, this is a very common choice, and it's where the knight belongs. It's aiming at that c4 pawn that just appeared. It's unmasking this bishop on b7. I would say white's still a little bit for choice, but white's not going to ram for it on the king side effortlessly, as he does in the game. cx-d4 just completely opens things up. It opens up the e file, opens up d4-d5 as a stronger break for white. This unleashes white's entire position. So white takes back on d4 with the e-pawn. This is as ideal attacking setup for a hanging pawn as you can basically get. Look at both of these bishops. They're just optimally placed. They're behind these hanging pawns, ready to be completely unleashed. The queen's on the e-file. That'll be enhanced by d4-d5. The rook's on the c-file. That'll be enhanced by d4-d5. This rook will either go to e1 or d1 eventually. And in both those instances, d4-d5 will increase that rook scope as well. Everything about white's position is organized for the d4-d5 pawn break. Again, in these positions, d4-d5, it's the very first thing you want to analyze. And here, all of white's position is ready for that pawn break to happen. Bishop b1, of course, we want to keep that light squared bishop. That's one of our most important attacking pieces. Knight e5, not necessarily bad, but d5 is more direct. b2, knight d4. So this harmonizes beautifully with both the queen on b2 and the bishop on b1. It's often the case against a castled black king on the king side that a knight hopping f5 is nearly decisive. And you see that in the games of Kasparov most pointedly. Also from the black side, when you're attacking a white king on the king side, a knight landing to f4 is often decisive. Here, knight d4 is decisive. It's hitting this weak pawn on e6. It's threatening to just land on f5. Rook f8 is virtually forced. If black takes, this is completely gone. You know, knight e7 check is going to come, followed by knight g6. This is, or just rook to the 7th rank on the e7 square. You know, this is completely dead. But even on rook f8, and then f4. I didn't want to go too deep into analysis because it's far afield from our hanging pawn discussion, but this blasts open the position for white. This is completely decisive. This is a decisive attack for white. So knight e5, it's not bad, but d5, again, in these positions, d4, d5 is the thematic move that you want to be looking at every single move for these sorts of structures. f4, this is methodical. It's fine, but again, d4, d5. cd. And white has a completely decisive attacking formation. Next move, either queen d3, queen e4, or queen c2 is going to come. And white doesn't really have, or black doesn't really have a great response, or any response to either of those. This is a winning attack. Knight c6. Little bit inaccurate. I mean, this is still gone for black. Rook a c8 at least finishes mobilization. d5, again, this is the move you want to be aiming for. And now devastation is coming on the long diagonal. But this is a direct result from d4, d5. This break forced black to give up that valuable dark square bishop. Black's kingside is completely devastated. This is a winning attack for white. I also give another note. f5 also works in this position. But again, d5, it's just the move you want to be looking for in these structures. Again, all of white's pieces are perfectly poised to take advantage of that break. So it's up to white to make that break happen. But knight c6 just steps right into it. EX, CX. It's a pawn sacrifice, but again, all of white's pieces are just completely activated by this d4, d5 break. Even when d4, d5 is a pawn sacrifice, that sacrifice is so often worth it just because it activates all of white's army. Queen h7, and then just this simple little quiet move cutting the black king off. Black resigns here. This is completely gone. White can just play knight d7 and then queen h8 mate, or just knight takes c6, or knight g6 followed by taking on g6 with the bishop. There's just a lot of different ways to open the e file followed by a simple mating attack. So Levenfish resigned here. So very thematic game. Really the key that I want you to look at from this game was the structure transition here. So first off, knight xc3, it's needless waste of time. Reinforces white's center needlessly. Again, in these positions that you'll get in these games, often keeping the tension in the center and forcing the other guy to break the tension is a better choice. You don't want to be spending the time yourself to break that tension. But white's choice here to accept the hanging pawns with c4. Objectively, it's not necessarily better than an e4 push, but I think practically, when you play aggressively, aggression pays off in chess. Whenever you're on the attacking side in your games, practically you're going to be doing better. It's much easier to attack than defend, and c4 is just the aggressive path here. White could play e4 here, but again, this is much less aggressive. The bishops are more blunted out. This key attacking diagonal from b1 to h7 is blunted out. It's harder for white to get a good attack going here, whereas after c4, it's very easy for white to get a dangerous attack going here, and black immediately goes wrong. When you're defending against a hanging pawn structure like this, again, the goal is to keep things closed up. cxd4 immediately opens the position up, and this is as ideal a hanging pawn structure as you can get. All of white's pieces are just perfectly poised. And that d4, d5 break is the catalyst for this chemical reaction in the position. White, as soon as that d4, d5 break happens, things just completely break open, and white has an overwhelming attack. And you can see how quickly it happens. Now, this is already gone for white. Levenfish resigns on move 23, and his position has been losing for at least 5 or 6 moves. But that d4, d5 break, or even just the threat of d4, d5, that's the catalyst to the position. So we're going to look at another example in our next video of the d4, d5 break, just because it is so key. But I want this to be the one point that I really hammer home in the review, is that d4, d5, that pawn break with your hanging pawns. You want to be looking at that every move when you have the hanging pawns. That's the key to the position. Pawn breaks are always the key to any position, but especially with hanging pawns, that d4, d5 break, that's so often the catalyst to anything good happening with your position. So, excellent game from Chekhover. We'll see you next time for another d4, d5 example.